All right, so Carl Jung, he founded a school of thought called analytic psychology. So he sort of shortened. So whereas Horney added a word in front of psychoanalytic, Jung distinguished himself by taking psycho off the front of it. So now it's just analytic psychology. Um, Carl Jung was the heir apparent to the Freudian school of thought. He and Freud were the best of friends and they really saw eye to eye on everything. They traveled together all the time and things. But ultimately, they had a falling out because Jung differed too much from Freudian theory, and Freud did not like people who differed from him. So, one by one, each of these followers that I'm talking about, who were contemporaries of Freud and who worked with Freud and used him as a mentor and stuff, one by one, he kicked them out of his little group. Like they were no longer welcome at the Psychoanalytic Society anymore because they made him unhappy because they had their own thoughts. So Jung ultimately got kicked out. But he has a pretty complicated model, so I'm going to make a kind of messy screen here as I try to explain Jung's analytic psychology. So the basic principles. First off, causality plus teleology. So causality refers to the fact that he thinks that our behavior and our personalities are affected by our past experiences. And then teleology refers to the fact that we're striving towards some kind of unknown future. So he thought it was like sort of an equal parts that, you know, the things that happened to us in childhood and growing up are really important in shaping us. And that, you know, knowing that we're working towards a future, knowing that we're trying to become our full selves and stuff like that also informs our behaviors. So we call that causality plus teleology. He agreed with Freud that there was a personal unconscious. Like, remember, Freud had that iceberg picture, and everything that's below the water level is unconscious. Freud thought that that unconscious was comprised of personal experiences, personal wishes, personal embarrassments, all this stuff that you don't want to have to think about anymore because it's embarrassing. Jung agreed with that we have this personal unconscious where all of our unacceptable wishes and our unacceptable memories and all of the things that we don't want to ever see again, we can place into our personal unconscious. And that personal unconscious is going to be just like Freud said, it's going to have to be maintained. We don't want those secrets coming out. And so that can cause some tension in the unconscious. What differed significantly for Jung is that he thought we also carry around with us something he called the collective unconscious. And this is an unconscious that contains information that we inherited as a member of the human species. So he believed that this is passed down from one generation to the next, based on, just natural biological inheritance, just like eye color and other things are transmitted. He said so it would be this collective unconscious. In the personal unconscious, just to illustrate personal versus collective, one difference that Jung had from Freud was that he thought that there was more accessibility to the personal unconscious than Freud thought there was. So that's one thing. It's not quite as locked away from us as Freud thought it was, according to Jung. It also contains what he called complexes. And he got that term from another follower that we're going to talk about later, but we'll just go ahead and go from here. Complexes are groups of related unconscious material that can motivate our behavior. So you can have complexes surrounding feeling inferior, or you can have complexes surrounding feeling superior, or sort of neurotic complexes where you're feeling like there's something wrong with you, or that you're experiencing anxiety. These kinds of things, they can all be kind of grouped together, and the key thing is unconscious, and then they motivate your behavior without you knowing that that's what's motivating your behavior. So complexes are really super important for him because these are going to drive behavior, and the person doesn't necessarily know that they exist, let alone that they're driving behavior. The collective unconscious, on the other hand, he thought was highly influential even in healthy personalities, that the collective unconscious is important for all of us. it's a core structure of the personality, he said. It's really key. And it consists of predispositions, not memories, because this is something that all humans share. So it wouldn't be personal memories. It would be sort of natural ways of reacting to things, right? Like natural sort of unconscious, I like to call them knee-jerk kinds of reactions that you might have, may be driven by collective unconscious content. So, the idea that, this is a pretty complicated example. I don't know if I want to give it. I'll just say this. The collective unconscious is very similar to the idea that maybe we have inherited through evolution some predispositions. The idea that, things that have been beneficial to our species in getting the genes forward from one generation to the next, those kinds of traits are probably collective unconscious kinds of traits in Jung's model. So it's very similar to the explanations that evolutionary psychologists would give as far as, you inherited this. In the collective unconscious are what he calls archetypes. These are universal thought forms that allow us to be aware of the environment and selectively respond to it. So in the collective unconscious, we have archetypes such as like the persona versus the shadow. One of the ways that he supports his claim that these are universal and probably part of the human species is he looks cross-culturally. And he especially likes to look at myths, and he likes to look at fictionalized stories, those kinds of things. And he will point to the fact that all around the world, there are stories and myths involving an individual who tries to mask his true self and present a persona instead. So the true self would be the shadow, the part that the person's embarrassed of and doesn't want other people to know about. And then the persona is the masked part, the part that they want to show and have everybody think is them. So that's one example of an archetype. Another example of an archetype would be the anima, animus, or what we might say the masculine and the feminine archetype. And so what we have here is like expectations about what it means to be male, expectations about what it means to be female. And again, he looks all around the world, looks at fictional accounts and myths and stuff like that, and sees that very consistently around different cultures, we have expectations for male behavior and expectation for female behavior. And he says this is probably because it's part of the collective unconscious. It's part of what we've inherited as a member of the species. Okay, so there are more archetypes that are in your collective unconscious than these two examples that I've given you. But what you'll notice is that there's always like a this and a that, persona, shadow, anima, animus, right? Like there's a this and a that. These polar opposites need to be unified by the self. So for you to be able to see yourself as a coherent person, even though you've got some parts of yourself that you want to present to the world and other parts of yourself that you don't want the rest of the world to see, right? That we would call your shadow. Even though you have some masculine traits and you have some feminine traits, you have to unify, the self has to unify these disparate parts into a coherent presentation, not just for the world, but also for yourself, right? So that you can understand yourself and see yourself as consistent. Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of, how the self unifies the different parts into a coherent sense of self. How does it do it? Well, one way is through compensation. Compensation refers to the idea that if there's a deficiency in one aspect, that's going to cause an increase in the polar opposite effect. So if you have, not a really strong persona, you're not really sure what part of yourself you want to show to the rest of the world, you may have a larger shadow. We see this in stories about, people who are evil, right? Or, sociopaths or psychopaths, where they don't have much of the persona. They don't have much of the good side of their personality, but they have a lot of the shadow. And it's all they can do to just sort of hold on enough to mostly present the persona. And then the shadow more and more takes over. That's what we call compensation, where one side's going to be stronger than the other. With regard to masculinity and femininity, one of the things that Jung talked about is how at certain ages, one side will be more dominant than the other, and that as you age, they'll start to even out more. He said when we're in our reproductive years, it's more likely that one or the other side of your personality will come out. Either the masculine side will be more represented or the feminine side. He, of course, thought that it would be consistent with your actual sex, given his time period and things that he was talking about. But he thought, we would be much more sex typed, he said, in our behaviors during our reproductive years. And then as we get older and, our kids are grown and these sort of sex typed times of our life are over with, we can start to explore the other side and let it grow more. So compensation is one way. Opposition is the other way. The aspects can conflict with each other and cause tension, right? And again, I'll go back to the sociopath or psychopath as an example of the persona shadow conflict, right? Because we oftentimes call a person who's got a disorder like that, we'll say that they're decomping. They're having difficulty figuring out how to control the bad side of themselves enough to be able to function in everyday life and put on their persona and walk around, because those conflicts, there's this really strong conflict, causes a bunch of tension. And so you might see like clusters of them acting out and things like that because they really can't cope otherwise. Jung would say that's because of this tendency for opposition, where these aspects that are in conflict, that causes tension, causes stress, and can cause the person to sort of break down. The transcendent function, to get a little bit more positive, is ultimately what happens in a healthy, growing personality is that we're going to have synthesis of the contradictory aspects and ultimately have a unified personality. Again, he thought that this is more likely to occur as we age, like as we're getting into our 30s and 40s and 50s, we get a more and more unified personality, because he thought it had there's a lot of pressure on us when we are in our reproductive years, trying to establish ourselves in careers, finding a mate, all these, there's a lot of pressure on us. And so there isn't a lot of energy left over for the transcendent function to really manifest itself. So it may take time. It's not something that he would expect a 20-year-old to be able to display. He would expect us to start working on it in our 20s, and then maybe starting to bring parts together in our 30s, and then by our 40s maybe really be experiencing our transcendent function and into middle adulthood and old age and so on. So it's a pretty complex model, but I find that a lot of students really like the Jungian model. It sort of fits how I think a lot of us think about ourselves. And so a lot of people say, why do we talk about Freud so much and not Jung as much, right? Because he seems more, Jung, for one thing, seems inherently nicer than Freud does. He's still a little sexist, honestly. I mean, I think it was the time when they were working. So still a little bit of sexism going on here. And, even I think we could probably argue that there might be some sexism in Horney's model because she sort of was a product of her era. But a lot of people really like the Jungian interpretation because of, I think maybe because of this kind of yin and yang kind of, polar opposites working together and like that. So it's a pretty interesting model. Let's give a head-to-head comparison of Freud versus Jung, maybe why they had the bad breakup. Freud says that all anxiety comes from trying to keep information repressed. He said that there's only the one unconscious, the personal unconscious, and that the only things that are in there are bad. That they really, the stuff that you store in your personal unconscious is bad. Jung, on the other hand, said the anxiety came from tension between the different aspects of yourself, and that, some stuff that you have in your unconscious might be bad, but some of it might be good. Some of it might be personal and you placed it there, and some of it might be, collective unconscious contents that are just your natural heritage. So the two of them had their bad breakup because ultimately they could not resolve their differences regarding the unconscious, the personal versus the collective, and the good versus the bad components. They just really couldn't resolve that. And so ultimately they had their falling out, and Freud when he decided that he did not like Jung anymore after having had such a close, everyday talking, traveling together and all those things, he never spoke to Jung for the rest of his life. That was it. He was done. And that's the kind of guy Freud was. So you can kind of also see why a lot of people prefer Jung. I don't think he would have cut out Freud because of differences, but Freud had a really big ego, that's for sure. And not the ego that he had in his iceberg model, but the ego we all mean when we say big ego. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up Jung here, and let's transition into Alfred Adler in the next video.